More Republicans are turning on President Trump. According to a new average of polls, nearly 2 in 10 GOP voters do not approve of Trump's job performance. It's his worst rating from his core constituency during his second term. Joining me to discuss, Geoffrey Skelley, Chief Elections Analyst at Decision Desk HQ. Hey, Geoffrey, thanks so much for coming on. So, Donald Trump has never gotten high approval ratings across the board, but he has usually been able to maintain his support among GOP voters. Is that something that you see changing, even if it's slightly, over this second term?
Right. So at the outset of his second term, President Trump had an approval rating among Republicans of about 90%, which is very much in keeping with where his approval was for much of his first term among Republicans. Outside of just sort of the first year or so of his first term, his approval rating among Republicans has usually been close to 90%. However, if we have the overall approval up there right now, his overall approval is hit. His overall disapproval has actually hit sort of a new high, almost 59% in our polling average, 57% in our polling average. But if you look at his approval rating among Republicans, which I have now brought up on the screen, he's down to about 81% among Republicans in terms of approval. 17% of Republicans disapprove. Now, look, crosstab numbers like this from different polls are always a little noisier. You're talking about smaller sample sizes within the overall sample. But nonetheless, I do think that you're going from 90% around the time he took office among Republicans to now in the low 80s, about almost 80%. In terms of approval, there's clearly been at least some decline among Republicans. Obviously, he's if 8 in 10 Republicans are still approving of him, that's still very solid support. But it does speak to at least some deterioration.
Among those people that he's losing or has lost, what do you think the issue is that's driving them away? I mean, it strikes me that we saw, maybe not here when it comes to just Republicans, but when you look at the broad section of the population around the month of December, there was some softening of support. And that strikes me as it's right in kind of the midst of this immigration crackdown, what we saw in Minnesota that I think rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And you also have the Epstein files, obviously, that's been in the headlines a lot. Can you point to either of those issues as possibly what has caused maybe some slippage with Republicans, but also with the broader population?
Well, I absolutely think that those events have played into Trump's declining approval rating, and the fact that he's hit sort of a new high in disapproval in our polling average, up to about 57% now. His approval rating had dropped a little bit anyway toward late last year, and I think some of that could be connected to dissatisfaction with the economy. We know that economic sentiment polling has not been particularly strong. People aren't feeling that great about things. And considering that Trump was one of the reasons he was elected in the first place was a message that and a background in his first term where people thought he was a good steward of the economy. Now with the Epstein files, which does sort of run against, I think, Trump's anti-establishment profile in terms of how he's positioned himself, maybe that's caused a few Republicans to become a little dissatisfied. I think more broadly, there's no question that the focus on immigration and ICE and what happened in Minneapolis and what's been happening around the country has probably not worked well for the president either. If you look at issue polling averages, his basically Trump's handling of different issues, immigration was traditionally one of his strongest, if not the strongest for him. And now he's generally underwater in a lot of that polling now, in the sense that more people disapprove of how he's handling immigration than approve of it. So when you have some of his strengths as a candidate, where whether you're talking about immigration or the economy, and now people are a bit more dissatisfied than satisfied with how he's handling those things, I think that's a clear contributor, and that's can go across the board in terms of partisanship, whether you're talking about Republicans, independents, and of course Democrats, who already very strongly disapproved of him.
One of the demographics that powered Trump to victory in 2024 was young men. And I've heard some chatter that there possibly has been a softening of support among young men, maybe because of the Epstein issue that kind of animated some of that maybe podcaster sphere that many young men were drawn into. Have you noticed any of that in your research?
So there's definitely evidence that Trump has lost support among younger voters. We know from the 2024 election that younger voters were, on average, a younger voter is somewhat less politically engaged, and we know that voters who were somewhat less politically engaged actually were more likely to support Trump in the 2024 election than voters who were more politically engaged. And so, looking at Trump's improvement in terms of looking at the exit polls or other survey data, Trump certainly did better among, say, 18 to 29-year-olds than he did in his previous presidential elections in 2016 and 2020. Overall, he still lost that group, but he made inroads. And in some of those various survey data, he actually narrowly carried young men in the 18 to 29-year-old group. We don't have a ton of large sample data for this group, but the polling that we have seen that has focused specifically on younger people and young men has found at least some deterioration in his approval rating, his favorability ratings among this group. So I do think that there is evidence that among young people more broadly, whether you're talking about men or women, there's particularly been a deterioration in attitudes toward Trump, which maybe makes sense, at least if you're thinking that he has seen an overall decline in his approval rating and how people view him as president. The group that may have been sort of least committed, least nailed down as Republicans, because we know that younger people are not quite as firm in their partisan leanings. They haven't necessarily had as much time in politics to develop those opinions. The fact that perhaps they have been quicker to move away from Trump makes some sense then.
What about Hispanic voters? It's another demographic that swung to President Trump in the 2024 election. As the immigration issue becomes kind of more prominent in the discourse, and as President Trump declines in his popularity on that specific issue, has he taken a hit with Hispanic voters?
So interestingly, and I've just brought it up on screen, our crosstab data for this for Latinos, for Hispanics in polling, it's not necessarily at a record high for him in terms of disapproval, but his disapprove figure in our average is now at about 59% among Hispanics, 38% approve. He's been underwater among Hispanics, that is net negative in terms of approval rating for most of, almost the entirety of his presidency. But he was obviously a lot closer to 50-50 at the start. And it's kind of just varied a little bit like a wave throughout his presidency. So I don't know if it's necessarily that we can chalk it up to immigration. I think that is certainly a part of it. And I think it's important to remember that Hispanics are not a monolith. Different communities of Hispanics have different relationships with the immigration system, different attitudes about, and somewhat nuanced attitudes about things like border security, where they may favor border security more so than people might think, especially if perhaps they live in Texas near the border. And so there's variations across geography, across origin, that I think make this a little complicated to say one way or the other. But I do think that we know from the 2024 election that there was at least some evidence that one of the reasons why Trump was doing better among Hispanic voters was this was a group of voters who were particularly sensitive to economic conditions. And with the inflation during Joe Biden's administration and negative economic sentiment toward the end of Biden's 4 years in office, it was a group that was perhaps ripe to look to Trump. We also know Hispanic voters are younger on the whole. Remember, a lot of times when we're talking about these different crosstab groups, a lot of different groups, there's overlap here, right? It's not just young people and Hispanics. A lot of young people are Hispanic. It's basically the youngest group in terms of race and ethnicity on average in terms of age. So you're also talking about a group of voters who are not as perhaps firm in their partisan attitudes, more independent, less engaged politically oftentimes. And so were maybe attracted to Trump because they were very dissatisfied with the status quo under Joe Biden, but now maybe not feeling as thrilled with how Trump's handled the presidency, whether you're talking about the economy or immigration or other issues, are now somewhat moving away from him.
I want to ask you about Kamala Harris. There has been some speculation in the news that she is laying the groundwork for a 2028 presidential campaign. She wrote a book. She did a book tour. She's relaunched her social media, all things that look like something a potential presidential candidate would do. She does lead early polling among Democrats for the Democratic primary for 2028, but she also is relatively unpopular with voters as a whole. What do you make of her as a candidate and kind of where she's at now and where she would need to go to improve her chances?
Right. So the Decision Desk HQ, we just brought out a favorability average for Kamala Harris, and this is among all respondents. You know, a poll could be of registered voters or likely voters or just all adults. But asking, do you have a favorable opinion of Kamala Harris or do you have an unfavorable opinion? And at the moment in our average, about 47% say that they have an unfavorable view of Kamala Harris, and about 43% say they have a favorable view. If we kind of look over data in our average going back to the beginning of 2025. She's more often than not been net negative on this question, somewhat more unfavorable than favorable. She's also very well known. You're talking about about 90% of people having an opinion, favorable or unfavorable of her. And so I think the concern for Democrats looking ahead to 2028 is that if Kamala Harris ran for president and went on to win the nomination, a lot of people already have pretty firm opinions of her. She's a well-known figure. She was vice president. She was obviously ended up being the substitute Democratic nominee in 2024 after Joe Biden withdrew from the race. So she is well known. And I think the question mark for a party in any election is, would you rather go with someone who's a little less well known? Obviously, they become more well known over the course of the presidential primary, but does that person have an opportunity maybe to win over some voters who weren't as attracted to, say, Kamala Harris, or have made up their minds about Kamala Harris to some extent, or are therefore less open to changing them? Whereas someone who's not as familiar to voters may have an opportunity to build a more positive, favorable attitude from the start, and then carry that into the general election. Obviously, things are very polarized in our country at the moment. So Republicans have very, very negative attitudes for Kamala Harris. The good news for Harris, when you think about the potential Democratic presidential nomination contest, is that opinions among Democrats or Harris voters are very positive. Some polls 90% favorable of Kamala Harris among Democrats, or 80% plus, depending on sort of how you're cutting down the data within that among Democrats or Harris voters in 2024. But nonetheless, the constituency that will likely decide the Democratic nomination in 2028, Democrats or Democratic leaning voters, they like Kamala Harris. And so that gives her at least a pretty decent platform to start. If we look at just early primary polling, and this is so early, I don't want to overstate what it means, but she does lead in sort of over the last month, just a few polls testing out well-known names: Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, Pete Buttigieg, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, and she leads among them. Now, that could change. We're a long way from really the 2028 cycle fully starting. That is right after the 2026 midterms is usually right after the midterm is usually when the presidential contest really gets going. But nonetheless, Harris releasing a book, going a book tour, doing lots of public events, rebranding her social media, and sort of rejuvenating that aspect of her public persona. These all seem like signs of somebody who is certainly very seriously considering running again.
Does it surprise you at all that she's so far ahead of other people that, I don't know, seem to have become household names in Democratic circles, at least Newsom, AOC? I mean, she's pretty good distance out in front of them. Again, we're way out in front, but I would imagine most Democrats know about them as well, no?
Well, it's interesting. At the end of the day, if you look, we have a favorability poll for Gavin Newsom, and in that, just overall, the share of people who are familiar with him is only about 75%. So in the sense that he is well known, and among people who are particularly politically engaged, people know who Gavin Newsom is, but they still don't know him as well as they know Kamala Harris. And so I do think it's important to remember that when someone's seeing a primary poll with 12 name options, or that they're being given by the pollster, it's easier to go with the name and they're most likely to know Kamala Harris's name. So there's certainly name recognition is playing into this to some extent. I don't want to undersell it, though, that being well known can be a positive when in the long run, if you're well liked, and she is well liked among Democrats, and so that could, in the end, help her be in a position to be a front runner for the Democratic nomination in 2028.
Yeah, I wonder if there's Democrats out there that think that she didn't get a fair chance to really put her whole effort into a campaign. You talked about it possibly being too early to really put too much stock into this polling. When would it matter? When would you say, okay, now what we're seeing among Democratic primary voters is actually telling us something because we're close enough to the election?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I don't, again, early polls are by their very nature not as accurate as later polls when you get closer to the actual voting. For a presidential primary, that'll be early in 2028. But the campaign and debates and things like that will really get going in earnest probably in the summer of 2027, and candidates will be announcing their campaigns even right after the 2026 midterms and early in 2027. That's how this works. It's the permanent campaign, if you will. I think that what's worth remembering is that in our day and age of more nationalized politics and more attention being paid to this stuff, there is some evidence that early polls are a bit more predictive than they perhaps once were. So I would really be watching to see in sort of the first 3 months of 2027, is anyone else sort of challenging Harris, or is she consistently leading in these polls? That's not to say that if she's doing that, she'll go on to win the Democratic nomination. I do think, though, that if people are becoming more aware of the presidential campaign and you get into the middle of 2027, in the summer of 2027, and she's still leading, that would certainly put her in a decent position before we get into really the hotter part of the campaign late in 2027 and into the actual voting in 2028.
All right, let's talk about Texas. We have a Republican primary there that has been drawing a ton of attention. Early voting has started. The last time we spoke, we were talking about questions about whether or not John Cornyn, the incumbent senator, would actually even make the runoff. Do we have any clear picture of that since we last spoke?
Yeah, I think at this point, Cornyn is still favored to make a runoff, but obviously an incumbent being forced into a runoff and potentially finishing second in the initial primary vote is a pretty weak position to be in for an incumbent senator. Right now in our polling average, Ken Paxton, who has led this contest basically the whole time, he's at about 32% in our polling average. Cornyn's at about 28%, and Wesley Hunt, congressman, is at about 19%. But I think it's also worth remembering primary polling is, by its very nature, it has a lot more error than general election polling, and that comes down to the fact that for some voters in the Texas primary, they may not like John Cornyn, but they may be open to Wesley Hunt or Ken Paxton because they want to change, but they're not sure which person they want to change from. They could move between them. Someone who might like Cornyn but is worried about his chances against Paxton. Wesley Hunt has certainly been positioning himself as, hey, I can be a more MAGA-friendly conservative alternative to Paxton, who a lot of Republicans are scared about being the GOP nominee in the general election because of a number of personal and professional scandals in his background. Maybe Cornyn would lose to Paxton, so maybe I will vote for Hunt and give Hunt a shot in a runoff against Paxton, and maybe Hunt can beat Paxton in a head-to-head runoff. So that's the thing, is that they're moving parts here, and voters are not necessarily absolutely locked in on these candidates because they might like more than one, or at least be open to more than one, in a way where in a general election context, most voters lean one way or the other at the outset toward the Democrats or the Republicans. And so they're not likely to move between those two sides in the same way that you'll have in an intra-party contest.
Yeah, that last little blip down at the very end of that graph there with Wesley Hunt going down and John Cornyn going up has to be allow the Cornyn camp to breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief, getting away possibly from that nightmare scenario where Cornyn wouldn't even make the runoff election. One wild card in this race is President Trump. He's basically kind of said that he likes all three candidates here. It doesn't appear that he's going to endorse. Of course, a Trump endorsement would be a huge lifeline potentially to John Cornyn. I know some of his Senate colleagues are urging the president to do so. But so far, I mean, I think we heard again this week, President Trump appears that he's going to stay out of this.
Absolutely, especially in crowded races like this, in sort of the Trump era. We have seen President Trump, or even when he was out of office, come in and endorse candidates, and that provide A little clarity and support for a particular candidate and draw voters in the Republican primary electorate to that candidate. And so, if you think about a crowded race like this, or a three-way race that is kind of muddled, that would potentially at least move some portion of the electorate toward that candidate. And I do think in this context it might be difficult for any one candidate to break 50%, even with Trump's endorsement this close to the primary. I don't think you're going to have someone drop out ahead of March 3rd, even if Trump endorses somebody. But it does seem at this point that Trump is not very likely to endorse anyone. He's been given opportunities to put it out there and seems to be maybe waiting. Maybe his thought is that the race is likely to go to a runoff. He'll see who the two candidates are, and maybe he'll decide to sort of become involved at that point.
Want to talk about the Democrats in Texas, because obviously I know you haven't been put this in your release, but I always want to ask you about it because the Democratic side of the Senate race in Texas is also extremely fascinating. Tallarico has been in the news a lot this week. There was this interview with Stephen Colbert that there was allegedly pressure for it to not be aired. It ended up being on YouTube. It's got like more than 5 million views at the moment. Tallarico has been having some good fundraising numbers. The betting markets favor Tallarico. Early voting obviously also started on the Democratic side. Jasmine Crockett is the other major candidate among the Democrats. She's a state congresswoman from Texas. What do you make of where that race is at now? I know we don't have a ton of polling there, but obviously a lot of interest.
Yes, we don't have an average of this yet, just because we have sort of a threshold of how many polls we like to have before we put an average up, and we're not quite there. Again, Jasmine Crockett, the congresswoman, got into this race right at the filing deadline in December, so we don't even have much data from before her entry that tested her as a candidate. It was sort of a last minute entry, and even prompted Colin Allred, another candidate in the race, to drop out and actually run for more or less his old U.S. House seat instead. So I think with the Tallarico Crockett matchup, the polls suggest a close race. We've had a handful of polls that showed Crockett ahead by a few points. We've had a couple that have shown Tallarico ahead. I think Tallarico, in terms of some of the non-polling indicators, the fundraising, perhaps the attention economy that we live in, some of those things have maybe been going his way as of late. Early voting has started in Texas, and obviously he's been getting a lot of attention at this particular moment. So maybe that would help him if some voters are going into the voting booth to vote early and are thinking about Tallarico more than Crockett. At the same time, though, it does look like it's a highly competitive race, and I in the sense that it's pretty likely that we'll get a nominee that night. There is a third candidate, very minor third candidate in the race, so it is possible that race could also go to a runoff because no candidate gets a majority. But it does look like a very close race. I think both candidates have reasons to be somewhat confident, which is exactly the scenario where you really don't know how it's going to play out.
All right, yeah, we'll definitely be watching the Lone Star State there March 3rd, right? That's when the vote
Yes.
tallies are all put together. So we'll be watching that night and checking with you in between now and then, because your insight is invaluable as we head into this election season. But really appreciate you spending some time with us, Geoffrey Skelley, Chief Elections Analyst at DDHQ. Thanks, man.
Hey, thanks for having me.